The morning after the storm, the valley looked like the end of the world. Snow had swallowed everything. Fence posts, well covers, the low stone walls that marked the edges of claimed land. Drifts climbed the sides of square cabins until they reached the eaves, pressing against the walls like something alive and hungry. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, exhausted threads. The cold was absolute. The kind of cold that did not howl or threaten. It simply settled, quiet and permanent, over everything that was left standing. And in the middle of that white silence, one cabin stood different from all the others. Its north face came to a point, not a wall, a blade. A sharp wooden edge aimed directly into the direction the storm had come from, and the ground around it was nearly bare. No drift piled against it. No weight pressed its walls inward. The snow had struck that pointed edge and split, flowing down both angled sides the way water parts around the bow of a ship, depositing in two long tapered ridges that fanned out behind the structure like a wake. The cabin itself sat in a pocket of clear ground, as if the storm had simply decided to go around it. A man stood before that cabin with his hat in his hands. He was not a small man. He had broad shoulders and a jaw like a timber beam, and hands that had built 3 cabins in this territory with nothing but an axe and his own knowledge of wood. He had survived seasons that killed other men. He had looked at this cabin 4 months ago and said, plainly, without cruelty, but without softness either, that the woman building it would be the death of her children. He was standing at her door now, not to collect anything, not to offer anything. He was standing there because he had spent the night watching his own north wall fail, the chinking blown out in 3 places, the drift reaching his roof line, the temperature inside his cabin dropping degree by degree no matter how much wood he fed the stove. And then, when the storm finally broke and he walked out into the ruined valley, he had seen her cabin sitting clean and untouched in the white wreckage of everything around it. He had come to ask her how, but that answer would have to wait. Because the story of that cabin, the story of that pointed, impossible, ridiculous-looking cabin that everyone in the valley had laughed at for 4 months, did not begin on the morning after the storm. It began on a late summer afternoon, on a raw pine platform, with a woman stepping down from a train with $9 in her pocket, and 3 children who needed her to be right about something she had never done before. The platform smelled of fresh-cut wood and distance. The town behind it was barely more than a suggestion. A general store with a false painted front, a small church, a lumber yard, a scattering of frame buildings that looked like they were still deciding whether to stay. Beyond all of it, the land opened in every direction, without walls, without trees, without anything to stop the eye. Grass ran to the horizon in long silver waves, bent by a steady wind out of the northwest. Mara Solvang set her trunk down on that platform and looked at all of it without moving. She was 31 years old. She had gray eyes and a dark hair, and the kind of stillness that comes not from peace, but from having already made a decision that cannot be taken back. Her husband Eric was in the ground in a town 3 days east of here, buried in frozen earth beside a river that had opened too early in the spring and taken him under. He had been a strong man and a careful man, and he had loved her in the steady, unshowy way of a man who shows up every day. He had built everything they owned with his own hands. Now his hands were gone, and Mara had used the last of their money to file on 160 acres of land she had never seen, in a territory she did not know, because the land was cheap, and the law said she could claim it in her own name, and because there was nowhere else to go. Elsa was 9, and she understood more than she should have. She stood beside the trunk with her chin lifted and her eyes moving over the town with the careful attention of a child calculating odds. Joren was 7. He had not spoken since the morning they pulled his father's body from the river. He stood close to Mara's side, close enough that his shoulder pressed against her hip, and he looked at the ground. Lena was 4 and had spent the last 2 days of the train journey coughing. A dry, persistent sound that had not yet turned into anything worse, but had kept Mara awake through both nights, listening. A church deacon in their old town had loaned her a hand axe with a cracked handle and told her she was making a mistake. She had thanked him for the axe and said nothing about the mistake. The land was 17 miles from town. A man with a wagon charged her $2 to haul the stove and trunk out to it. She walked beside the wagon. The children walked behind it. The prairie grass was taller than Joren. They reached the claim at dusk. A creek ran along the southern edge, not wide, but lined with cottonwood and elm. Slender trees, most of them, 8 to 10 inches through the trunk. But they were trees, and trees were logs, and logs were a cabin. Everything else in every direction was grass and wind and the enormous, indifferent sky. Mara spent the first night under a canvas lean-to between 2 cottonwoods. She lay awake listening to Lena cough and to the wind, which did not stop. She began cutting the next morning. By the end of the first week, she had felled 1 tree per day. 7 trees. Not one of them had been dragged to the building site, because dragging a 10-inch cottonwood log 200 yards through waist-high grass without a horse was simply not something her body could do. She had tried. She had looped a rope around the butt end of a log and pulled until the rope burned her palms raw and the log moved 4 feet. It was on the 3rd day that Halvard Gruen arrived. He came on horseback, a lean and weathered man who had built more and survived more than anyone else in the valley. He had seen 2 territories and 3 terrible winters. He walked her claim without speaking, looked at the scattered felled trees, looked at the building site, looked at the children under the lean-to. Then he looked at Mara. He told her exactly what she would need: 70 to 80 logs, square notches, a door hung true within a 1/4 inch, 4 cords of firewood stacked before the first snow. He said it all without malice and without hope. Then he said the thing he believed to be true, the thing a man with his experience and his knowledge of hard winters believed he owed her as a plain fact. Go back to wherever you came from. A woman alone cannot do this, and those children will pay for your pride. He mounted his horse and rode east. Mara watched him go. Then she picked up the hand axe and walked back to the next cottonwood. By the 7th evening, she sat on the riverbank with her hands wrapped in rags, shoulders aching to the bone, 1 log per day for 7 days, and not one of them in position. She watched the water move around 2 stones near the bank. One was flat-faced, square, and the water behind it churned in confused circles, foam collecting, debris piling. The other was a wedge, a tapered limestone slab pointing directly into the current. The water struck the narrow edge and divided. It flowed down both sides smoothly, cleanly, and the water behind it was still. Her father's voice came to her the way it always did, not as a memory, but as a presence, as clear as if he were sitting beside her on that bank. He had built fishing boats his whole life, small ones, 16 feet, with sharp prows designed to cut through cold water. He had said the same thing every time she watched him shape a bow. A flat bow fights the water. A sharp bow lets the water fight itself. Mara stood up. She walked to the building site and looked at the rectangle she had scratched in the dirt. The conventional cabin she had been planning. 4 flat walls. A flat north face aimed directly into the prevailing winter wind. She stood there for a long moment. Then she scuffed the rectangle out with her boot. She picked up a stick and drew a triangle. The point aimed north, directly into the wind. Behind her, she heard a sound she had not heard in 2 months. A small voice, quiet and uncertain, as if it had forgotten how to work. "What shape is that, Ma?" She did not turn around. She did not trust herself to turn around. "That," she said, "is our home." The triangle was not a plan. Not yet. It was a line in the dirt. A shape scratched by a stick in the fading light of a 7th evening, drawn by a woman who had spent a week failing at the only approach she knew, and had just watched 2 stones in a creek solve a problem that no amount of effort had touched. But a line in the dirt was somewhere to begin. She started the next morning before the children woke. The hand axe was still wrong for the work, made for splitting kindling, not shaping structural timber. But it was what she had, and she had learned in the past week how to work with it rather than against it. Short strokes, not long ones. Let the blade bite and clear before swinging again. Stop before the shoulders gave out completely, because exhausted arms made crooked cuts, and crooked cuts wasted wood she could not replace. The first problem of the triangle was the notching. A conventional cabin used square notches, 90 degrees, clean corners, the geometry of a right angle locking 2 logs together the way a handshake locks 2 hands. Every experienced builder in the territory knew how to cut a square notch. The angle was intuitive. Gravity pushed straight down. The notch held the log flat against the log below it, and the whole wall stacked up the way walls were supposed to stack. A triangle had no right angles at the converging end. Where the 2 angled walls met at the northern point, the logs came together at something closer to 60 degrees. And at 60 degrees, a square notch did nothing. The weight of the log pushed at a diagonal. The log wanted to slide outward, and without some other force holding it, the whole pointed end would simply open like a book in a strong wind. She spent the better part of 3 days making it not a problem. The first attempt split the log entirely. The second attempt produced a notch so shallow it held nothing. The third attempt cracked the log lengthwise when she tried to seat a second log against it. A sound like a rifle shot that sent Lena running to Elsa and made Joran look up from the firewood he was stacking. She sat in the dirt beside 3 ruined logs and looked at the sky. Then she tried something different. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire and drew the cut she wanted on the log before she made it, scoring the angle line first, slowly, the way her father used to mark his timber before the first cut. He had done it without thinking, the way a man does something he learned so young it became reflex. She had watched him do it 1,000 times without ever understanding why. The charcoal line gave her something to follow. It made the cut a tracing rather than a guess. The fourth attempt held. 2 logs, fitted together at the acute angle of the triangle's northern vertex, pressing against each other with a friction that was not as tight as a square notch, but did not slide. She rocked the upper log with both hands. It moved less than she expected. She packed river clay into the joint and rocked it again. It barely moved at all. Possible, she thought. It is possible. Possible was the only word she needed. The mockery started before the walls were 2 feet high. It arrived first through Elsa, who came back from the community well one afternoon, with her jaw set and her eyes holding the particular redness of a child who has cried in a field somewhere between here and there, so that she would not be seen crying. She set the water bucket down without spilling it and went to check on Lena without saying a word. That evening, Mara asked her what had happened. 2 girls at the well, Elsa said. She was looking at the canvas lean-to, not at her mother. They asked me what it was like living in a pie slice. What did you say? Nothing. A pause. I carried the water home. Mara looked at her daughter for a long moment. 9 years old, hauling water a quarter mile, absorbing what the world threw at her, and bringing it home intact. That was exactly right, Mara said. The name had come from the general store. Thomas Harwick had said it first, not quietly, not as an aside, but in the carrying tone of a man who wants the room to hear. He had said it while Mara was buying 3 pounds of common nails, the purchase that had taken her 2 days to decide on, because 3 pounds of nails at the current price would leave her with less than $5.50. And $5.50 was not a number that allowed for mistakes. Harwick had weighed the nails, wrapped them in brown paper, and then turned to the 2 men standing at the far end of the counter with his voice lifted just enough. Selling nails to a woman building a 3-sided house, he said, is like selling feed to a dead horse. One of the men laughed. The other looked at his boots. Mara picked up the nails and walked out. She did not speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood, with the cold clarity of a woman who had learned to calculate what she could afford, that anything she said in that store would cost her more than the nails had. Outside, in the thin autumn sunlight, she held the wrapped parcel against her chest and breathed. Then she walked the 17 miles home. The name spread the way names do in small places where everyone knows everyone else's business, and winter is long, and there is not much else to discuss. The pie slice. Within a week it had reached the church, the lumber yard, the families 2 and 3 claims over. Children repeated it without knowing what it meant, only that it was something to laugh at. Niels Dahl felt the pressure of it too. He was a practical man, not a coward, but he had a wife and 2 children and his own claim to prove. And when Harwick mentioned within his hearing that a man who lends his horse to a lost cause does not value his own claim, Niels stopped coming by. Not permanently, and not without guilt. Mara understood both of those things. But he stopped, and for 3 weeks, she worked without him. It was during those 3 weeks that she found the dog. Joran found him first, technically. He appeared at the edge of the claim one morning. A medium-sized animal of no particular breed, with a gray and brown coat, and one ear that had been torn at some point and healed badly, leaving it shorter than the other by half. He was thin in the way of an animal that has been managing on its own for a while. Not starving, but not comfortable. He sat at the edge of the grass and watched Joran stack firewood with the focused attention of a dog who has learned that children are usually the safest people in any situation. Joran saw him and stopped. He did not call out. He just stood there, holding a stick of wood in both hands, looking at the dog. The dog looked back. After a while, Joran set down the wood and sat down in the grass. The dog waited. Then he walked over and sat next to the boy, close enough that their sides were touching, and they stayed like that for a long time while the wind moved the grass around them. Mara came out from the building site and found them. She knew better than to say no. She could see it in the set of Joran's shoulders, not a plea, not the usual performance of a child wanting something, but something quieter and more serious, a need she did not have a precise name for. The boy had not spoken more than a handful of words in 2 months. He had worked without complaint, carried wood, filled water buckets, tended to Lena with a patience that was too old for him. He had done all of it in silence. "One more mouth to feed," she said. Joran looked up at her. He was not asking. He was simply waiting to see what she would decide. "He stays outside at night," she said. He did not stay outside at night. By the second evening, he was sleeping against the base of the lean-to, pressed into the corner where 2 support poles met. And by the end of the week, he had made it quietly clear that his position was between the children and any direction from which something unknown might approach. He did this without drama and without the anxious energy of a dog uncertain of its place. He simply positioned himself and stayed. Joran named him Birch for the color of his coat in certain lights. He did not announce the name. Mara heard him say it once, quietly, when he thought no one was listening. The boy crouched beside the dog at the edge of the creek, one hand buried in the gray-brown fur, saying the name once to see how it sounded. It was the most words he had used in 2 months. The first true crisis came in the way that the worst ones always do. Not all at once, but in accumulation, each small thing adding weight until the combined total was no longer manageable. By the middle of the second week, the salt pork was gone. The potatoes were gone. What remained was a small amount of dried corn, less flour than Mara had calculated, and the knowledge that the nearest place to purchase anything was 17 miles away, and she had less than $5 to her name. She had been eating less than she told the children. Not dramatically. She was not a woman who made theater of her sacrifices. But she had been taking smaller portions at every meal and saying she had already eaten, and Elsa had begun to look at her with the careful eyes of a child who suspects she is being lied to for her own good and is choosing not to say so. Lena's cough had deepened, not into something acute, not yet, but into a low, persistent rattle that came with every exhale and had been there now for more than a week. In the mornings, it was worse. Mara had no medicine. There was no physician within reach. There was no remedy she could purchase, and no remedy she could find in the creekside brush that she trusted. She could only keep the child warm and keep the fire going and watch the way Lena breathed, measuring the sound of it each morning to see if it had worsened in the night. It was on the 11th night that the matches ran out. Not entirely. She had 3 left. But 3 matches in a tin, when the fire had gone out overnight and the temperature had dropped below what her body could estimate, was not a reserve. It was a final margin. The first match was damp. It lit and immediately died. The second match caught briefly and went out before it touched the kindling. She sat for a moment in the dark with the third match in her fingers. The children were asleep. Lena's breathing was audible from the pallet. That low rattle, steady, present. Joran lay still in the way that meant he was not sleeping but was holding himself very quiet. He had learned to do that, to take up less space when things were difficult, as if reducing himself might somehow reduce the weight of what they were facing. She could not light the fire, and if she could not light the fire, the cabin, such as it was, walls only, no roof, barely adequate against the wind, would drop to a temperature the children could not sustain through the night. She held the third match between fingers she could barely feel and thought about her father. He had taken her out on the water once during a storm. Not deliberately, they had been caught by it. A squall that came in faster than anyone had expected and turned a calm crossing into something else entirely. The matches in his coat pocket were soaked through. He had sat at the bow with wet wood and a piece of flint he kept in a pouch at his belt, and he had struck it against the steel blade of his knife until sparks fell into a nest of dried fiber he had pulled from a rope's frayed end, and the fiber caught, and the small fire that resulted was enough. He had showed her how afterward. On the shore, in the calm after the storm, he had made her do it herself until she could do it without thinking. She had been 9 years old. She had not understood, at 9, why he was so insistent about it. She understood now. She set the third match back in the tin. She found a piece of flint in the creek bed. She had noticed it weeks ago, without knowing why she was noticing it. And she found a steel nail and the dried fiber of a rope and from the bundle Eric had packed in the trunk. She built the smallest possible nest of it in the center of the cleared fire space. It took 4 strikes. The 5th produced a spark that caught. She fed the fire carefully, one small piece at a time, until it was established enough to receive actual wood. Then she sat back on her heels and let the warmth move toward her. Joran was sitting up on the pallet, watching her. He had been awake the whole time. "How did you know to do that?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, but it was his voice. The voice she had been listening for every day since the river. "Your grandfather taught me," she said. She did not look up from the fire because she did not want him to see her face. "Everything you need is already inside you. He said we carry the people who taught us wherever we go." Joran was quiet for a moment. "Even Papa?" he asked. "Especially Papa," she said. She fed another piece of wood to the fire. Lena coughed once in her sleep and was still. Outside, Bert shifted against the lean-to post, settling deeper into his position. Joran lay back down. When Mara finally looked over, his eyes were closed and his breathing had slowed into the deep rhythm of actual sleep, not the shallow, guarded half-sleep he had been managing for 2 months, but the real kind. The kind that meant something had, at least for tonight, let go. She sat by the fire for a long time after that. She did not allow herself to think about tomorrow's matches, or the day after, or the week stretching ahead with its diminishing flower and its persistent cold, and its walls that were 3 feet high when they needed to be 7. She thought about Joran's voice, the rough, uncertain sound of it. She had been listening for it for 2 months, and now she had heard it, and that was enough for tonight. Tomorrow, she would solve tomorrow. Tonight, there was a fire. By the end of the 4th week, the walls of the triangle were 3 feet high. It was not enough, and she knew it. The ground would freeze in less than 6 weeks, and 3 feet of wall was less than halfway to the height the cabin needed to be. But 3 feet was more than 2 feet, and 2 feet had been more than one, and the triangle, for all the names the town was calling it, was standing. The notching had become something she could do without the charcoal marks, or nearly. She had developed a feel for the angle, the way a practiced hand develops a feel for anything done enough times in succession. The vertex joints still cost her more time than the straight wall sections. Each one was fractionally different, because each course of logs was shorter than the one below it as the walls converged toward the north point, and shorter logs behaved differently under the axe, but they held. Every one of them held. She had solved the hauling problem with the logs Niels could not help her move. The upper course logs were shorter, 12 feet, then 10, then 8, each one lighter as the walls tapered toward the vertex. And what she could not carry, she could roll. End over end, one rotation at a time. 200 yards of prairie grass that caught and tangled and pulled, but could be fought through. She did 3 logs per day at first, then 4. The rhythm of it became a kind of thinking. Her mind worked through problems while her body worked through the grass, and by the time she reached the building site, she often had the answer to whatever she had been turning over for the past 40 minutes. Elsa helped her set the starting position on each roll. A small thing, a hand on the log's end to hold the angle at the beginning, that saved 10 minutes per haul. Elsa did not comment on the work. She simply appeared each morning when Mara started the first roll of the day and held the log, and then went to her own tasks when it was in motion. It was the practical, wordless help of a child who has decided that things need to be done and has identified what she can contribute. Lena collected moss from the shaded side of the creek stones. Mara had shown her what kind to look for. Thick, dense, the type that held together under pressure, because moss pressed into a log gap, layered with clay, held against the wind better than clay alone. Lena did this with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who has been given a real task and intends to be found adequate. She brought the moss in both hands, a small green armload, and laid it in the clay bucket with care. Joran stacked firewood. He had been stacking firewood since the 2nd week, and by now the pile against the eastern cottonwood was taller than his head and 2 arm lengths wide. It was not enough for a full winter. They both understood this without discussing it, but it was growing, and growing mattered. Near the end of that 4th week, on a gray afternoon when the first real cold had begun to edge into the evenings, Wren Calloway appeared at the building site for the first time. Mara noticed her from a distance. A small woman in a dark coat, standing at the edge of the claim with something held in front of her. Not a threat, not an inspection. Just standing, watching, with the stillness of someone who has been watching for a while, and is not sure yet whether to proceed. Mara kept working. She was notching a 10-foot log for the east wall, and she did not stop. After a few minutes, the woman came closer. "I am the teacher," she said, "at the schoolhouse, 2 miles north." "I know," Mara said, a pause. "I brought some flour." She held up a cloth bag. "I baked too much. It happens." The bag was new, and the flour inside it was dry and unmistakable. Nobody baked too much flour and brought the excess to a building site across miles of open prairie by accident. But Mara understood what the offer was. An offer wrapped in a story that allowed both of them to receive it without the weight of charity pressing down on the exchange. She had seen this before, in her old town. The women who arrived with too much of something and a quiet excuse that protected the dignity of the recipient. It was a skill that required a certain kind of generosity, not just the giving, but the willingness to construct the fiction that made giving acceptable. "Thank you," Mara said. She kept her eyes on the log. "Elsa will take it." Elsa was there almost immediately, positioned at the edge of the claim with the instinctive readiness of a child who has learned to appear when strangers arrive and to assess the situation before advancing. She took the bag with both hands and said "thank you" in the careful voice she used when she was representing the family rather than simply being herself. Wren Calloway nodded. She looked at the walls, 3 feet of rough-hewn cottonwood, the base wall 20 feet across, the 2 angled walls converging toward a point that aimed north. She looked at it for long enough that Mara thought she might say something about the shape, something skeptical, or something curious, or something that required a response. "The angle at the north end," she said. It was not quite a question. "The point splits the wind," Mara said, "the same way a ship's bow splits water." Wren looked at the northern vertex for a moment. Then she looked at Mara, not at the walls, not at the logs, but at Mara directly. "I will bring more flour next week," she said, "if I bake too much again." She left without making anything more of it. No speech, no further questions, no performance of generosity beyond the flour and the simple statement that she would be back. Just a woman in a dark coat walking back across the prairie in the direction she had come from. Mara watched her go. Then she went back to the notch. The crisis that nearly ended everything did not arrive as a storm or a threat or a confrontation. It arrived as rain. It came on a gray October morning. The kind of rain that falls sideways in open country because there is nothing to stop it, nothing to redirect it, nothing between it and the ground, but the wind that carries it. The canvas lean-to leaked in 3 places. Lena woke coughing in the pre-dawn dark and would not stop until Mara held her upright against her chest for 20 minutes. Mara walked to the cabin. The walls stood at nearly 4 feet now. She stepped inside the triangle into the space that would someday be the interior, and looked up at the open sky where the roof would be. Rain fell straight through it. It pooled on the dirt floor in 3 places and ran along the base of the north wall in a thin brown rivulet. The chinking she had pressed into the lower courses 3 weeks ago was washing out in pale streaks, the clay dissolving where the rain struck directly. She crouched and pressed a handful back into the nearest gap. It would not hold. The rain would take it out again before morning, and the gap would be open. And the gap had been the problem she had spent 2 weeks solving, and now it was not solved. She stood in the roofless triangle and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding. The ground would freeze in 2 weeks. When it froze, she could not dig clay. When it froze, clay applied to the walls would not bond. The window of construction was closing, and what she had was 4 feet of wall, no roof, a dissolving wood pile, a sick 4-year-old, and less money than she had ever had in her adult life. Harwick had offered her $30 for the claim. 2 months ago, it had seemed like surrender. Standing in the rain now, looking at the open sky through the place that was supposed to be a roof, she tried to see it differently. $30. Enough for train tickets. Enough for 2 months of rented rooms while she found work as a domestic or a laundress or anything else that required her hands and paid in coin. Enough to get the children somewhere with a real roof and a real stove and real walls. Elsa would not have to carry water a quarter mile anymore. Joran would not have to drag branches through wet grass. Lena would sleep in a warm bed. She went back to the lean-to. She found a piece of paper in the trunk, one of the last pieces. She found the pencil stub. She sat down and began to write Harwick's name at the top. The pencil stopped. She had not told it to stop. Her hand simply paused, the lead touching the paper but making no mark, as if her body had decided something her mind had not finished deciding yet. From the direction of the creek, she heard movement, a dragging sound. She stepped out of the lean-to. Joran was coming across the wet grass from the direction of the creek. He was dragging a cottonwood branch, a long one, at least twice his length, and clearly heavy. He was not walking with it so much as pulling it, leaning his whole body into the effort, his boots sliding slightly in the wet grass with each step. His coat was soaked through across the shoulders. He had been out long enough for it to soak. He reached the firewood pile. He set his end of the branch down. He looked at the wet stack, repositioned himself, and began to drag the branch toward the drier side, where the older wood sat under the cottonwood trunk. He did not look at Mara. He was not performing this for an audience. He was simply doing what needed to be done because he could see that it needed doing, and because he had learned, somewhere in the quiet of the last 2 months, that seeing a need and acting on it were not two separate things. Mara watched him for a moment. A boy of 7 in the rain, dragging wood without being asked, without complaint, without any expectation of being noticed. His father's son, she thought. Exactly his father's son. She looked down at the paper in her hand. Harwick's name at the top, unfinished. She folded it once. Then she put it in her pocket and went back to the building site. She picked up the hand axe. She looked at the next log waiting to be notched. She set her feet and swung. It was the following week that the letter arrived. Wren Calloway brought it on one of her Thursday visits. She had been coming every Thursday now, always with something wrapped in cloth, and always with a quiet excuse for why the something happened to exist. This time she brought the cloth bundle in one hand and a slightly battered envelope in the other. "It came through the post at the schoolhouse," she said. "Addressed to your land claim. It had been following you." The envelope had Eric's handwriting on the outside. Mara took it and said nothing. She held it for the rest of the afternoon without opening it, not from fear, but from the same instinct that makes a person hold a gift for a moment before unwrapping it, wanting to keep the possibility of it intact a moment longer. She worked with it in her coat pocket, feeling the slight weight of it against her hip, knowing it was there. She opened it that evening, after the children were asleep. Eric had known his heart was not reliable. He had known it since the autumn before. A physician had told him plainly, and he had not told Mara because he did not want her to carry it, which was the decision of a loving man who underestimated what she could hold. He had prepared what he could prepare. He had taken the homestead filing documents to a man named Deacon Aldrich at the local church, a man known for keeping records carefully, and left a certified copy of the full land claim there, witnessed and dated and recorded in the deacon's own hand. At the bottom of the letter, one line, his handwriting, steady and unhurried. "You are stronger than you know. You always were." Mara sat with the letter in her hands until the candle burned low. She did not feel strong. She felt like a woman sitting in a lean-to in the dark with a sick child, and a half-built cabin and a winter arriving whether she was ready or not. She felt the full weight of everything she did not know and could not control and might not survive. But she also felt something else, something quiet and specific, arriving not as comfort exactly, but as information. Eric had believed this, not hoped it, not wished it, believed it, enough to write it down, enough to plan around it, enough to prepare a legal document for a future in which she would need to stand alone. He had looked at her, all of her, the woman he had known for 11 years, the woman who mixed clay and held saws, and lay awake listening to a sick child breathe. And he had written it down as a fact, not a consolation, a fact. She folded the letter and put it inside her dress against her skin. Then she blew out the candle and lay down in the dark and listened to Lena breathe, slow and steady and alive, and let herself sleep. The roof frame went up 11 days before the ground froze. The ridge beam, the largest log on the claim, the one that had been growing at the river's edge for decades, required 2 people and a horse to move. Niels came back. He appeared one morning at the edge of the claim, no explanation offered, his horse following behind him. He looked at the walls, which were now 7 feet high at the base and tapered cleanly to 4 feet at the northern vertex, and he stood there for a long moment with his hat in his hand. "My horse needs the exercise," he said. It was a thin excuse, and they both understood it. Mara accepted it the same way she had accepted Wren's flower, as an offer extended in the only form the person could manage, with the dignity of both parties preserved by the pretense. Together, they felled the ridge beam cottonwood with the crosscut saw, Niels on one end and Mara on the other, working in the long, steady rhythm of 2 people who know how to share a task without discussing it. The tree came down with a sound that shook the ground, landing with a crack that sent birds scattering from the cottonwoods for 100 yards in each direction. They limbed it and hitched it to Niels's horse and dragged it up the hill to the building site. The ridge beam ran from the center of the south wall to the northern vertex. When they set it in place, lifting it hand over hand up the ramp of stacked logs Mara had built for this purpose, inch by inch, the weight of it fighting them at every stage, the shape of the cabin became suddenly comprehensible in a way it had not been before. The ridge beam was the spine. The angled walls were the ribs. The northern point was the prow. Nils stepped back and looked at it. He stood there for a long time. He did not say that she had been right. He did not say that he had been wrong to stay away. He set 6 secondary rafters, cottonwood poles notched into the ridge beam, angled down to the side walls, forming the skeleton of the roof, and then collected his horse and walked back across the prairie toward his own claim. Halfway across the open grass, he stopped. He turned around and looked at the cabin's skeleton against the sky, the ridge beam running from south to north, the rafters fanning out from it, the pointed vertex catching the last of the afternoon light. Then he shook his head, slowly, quietly, and kept walking. Mara watched him go. She thought it might mean the same thing it had meant the first time, that he was looking at something he could not yet explain, and he was honest enough with himself to admit it. On the 20th day of October, Mara stepped inside the triangle for the first time without sky above her. The smell was cottonwood and tar paper and river clay. The ridge beam ran along the peak like the keel of an upturned boat. Light came through gaps between the logs where the chinking was not yet complete. thin lines of gray afternoon light that crossed the dim interior like the marks of a carpenter's pencil. But the roof was on, and it was hers, and the children were inside it, and tomorrow the ground was going to freeze. She allowed herself 10 seconds of something that was not yet relief, but was in the neighborhood of it. Then she picked up the clay bucket and went back to work. The first snow came 4 days later. Not the real kind. 4 inches, moderate wind, gone by afternoon. But when Mara opened the door in the early morning and walked around the cabin, she saw what she had built the triangle to do. The northern vertex was clean. Not dusted, not lightly accumulated. Clean. The bare logs of the pointed end sitting in a pocket of clear ground, while the snow lay everywhere else. She could see exactly where the drift had tried to form, and exactly where the angled walls had redirected it. 2 tapered ridges of snow fanned out behind the cabin like the wake of something moving through still water, and the cabin itself sat undisturbed at the center of its own stillness. She looked east, toward Nils's claim. His north wall was already wearing a drift that reached halfway up the logs. She looked at the vertex. A sharp bow lets the water fight itself. Gruen came by that afternoon on horseback. He stopped at the north end and looked at the clean ground, the drift pattern, the absence of accumulation. He looked at the chinking on the upper courses. He did not get off his horse. "You have not seen a real blow yet," he said. "That joint, that is where it fails. 3 layers of mud against a real winter wind." He let the sentence sit in the air. "I have built 3 cabins. Every spring I rechinked. Yours is prettier math than mine, but math does not keep children warm." He turned his horse east. Mara stood at the vertex and pressed her hand against the clay. Cold and hard and solid. She pressed harder. The wind moved past the point, splitting cleanly, making the low hiss she had begun to find something like reassuring. It was holding. But Gruen was not wrong about the upper joint. She had not enough clay left, and the freeze was coming. And the fraction of a chance that the point would hold through a real winter storm was a fraction she could not calculate with certainty. She went inside. She fed the stove, checked on the children. Lena was breathing more easily than she had in weeks. The warmth of the cabin, now that it held heat, was doing something that no amount of careful management in the open lean-to had managed. Joran sat near the stove with a borrowed primer open in his lap, his finger moving slowly under the words. Elsa was sewing a tear in her coat with the focused attention of a child who has decided that if things are going to be difficult, she would prefer to be useful while they are. Mara stood in the doorway of her pointed house and looked at her children. She thought about Joran in the rain, dragging a branch twice his length through wet grass without being asked. Outside, the wind moved through the valley. It found the northern point of the cabin and divided. The letter from the county arrived on a Tuesday. Thomas Harwick had filed a mineral rights claim against the creekside portion of her homestead. The claim asserted priority access to any subsurface resources along the waterway running through her land. A county inspector would arrive to assess the validity of the competing claims. If Harwick's filing was found to predate the homestead claim, the mineral rights would be separated from the surface title, hers in name, his in substance. The question was not whether Harwick wanted her land. She had understood that since the afternoon she had overheard him at the general store, the way he talked about creekside properties and what tended to lie under them. The question was whether he had filed his mineral claim before or after Eric had filed the homestead claim. Mara went to see the only lawyer in town. He told her plainly she needed documentation that predated Harwick's filing. It would cost more than she had to retain him. She thanked him and walked back out into the cold. The walk home was 17 miles, and she made it without stopping. She thought about Eric. She thought about the way he had prepared things. The homestead filing arranged before they had even discussed making the move. The arrangements made quietly and ahead of time. The quiet, methodical care of a man who thought beyond the immediate problem to the problems that might follow it. She thought about the letter she kept folded against her skin. The certified copy is with Deacon Aldrich. He witnessed everything. She had read that line. She had read the whole letter 3 times since Wren had brought it, and she had understood what most of it meant. But she had read that line as information about the past. Eric had filed documents. A deacon had witnessed them. This was the record of what had been done. She had not read it as instruction. She stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the snow-covered track. 17 miles of open country in both directions. The wind steady from the northwest, and read the line again in her memory. The certified copy is with Deacon Aldrich. Not was, not had been, is, present tense. Eric had written the letter in the autumn, knowing he might not survive the winter, knowing Mara might need to stand alone. He had not written about what had once existed. He had written about what she would find when she needed it. She started walking again, faster. Deacon Aldrich was an old man, thin and precise, with the manner of someone who understood that the keeping of records was not administrative work but a form of protection for people who had no other kind. He remembered Eric immediately. "Came in the autumn," he said. "Wanted it witnessed and dated and kept somewhere that was not his own house, in case something happened to the house." He paused. Or to him. He returned from the back room in 3 minutes with a folded document in a leather sleeve. The original date was at the top. It preceded Harwick's mineral claim by 11 days. She stood at Deacon Aldrich's table and held the document in both hands and breathed. Not with triumph, not yet, because the inspector had not come, and the county had not ruled, and nothing was finished. But with something that felt like ground under her feet after a long time of not being sure the ground was there. "He thought of everything," she said. Aldrich looked at her over his spectacles. "He thought of you," he said. "There is a difference." She walked home with the document in her dress, against her skin, beside the letter. She would win this. Not easily. And not yet. But she would win it. She knew it the way she knew the vertex joint would hold. Not from certainty, because certainty was not available, but from the knowledge that the thing she was working with was sound. Eric had built the foundation before she knew the foundation would be needed. That was who he had been. That was what she carried. What she did not expect was the weather. On a morning in the depth of winter, the cold changed. It softened. Not warm, nothing close to warm, but the air had a different quality, less sharp. The sky had shifted from the flat iron gray of sustained cold to something paler, almost luminous, a color she did not have a precise name for. The creek ice had a slightly different sound under her boots when she crossed it. Not the deep, resonant clunk of stable ice, but something fractionally higher in pitch, fractionally less certain. Birch would not settle. He had been moving since before dawn, slow, deliberate restlessness, circling the same perimeter again and again, pausing at the northwestern corner of the claim, lifting his nose, moving on. He had not eaten his morning portion. He sat at the northwest edge of the claim and looked at the horizon with an attention that was different from his ordinary watchfulness. Not the focused readiness of a dog that has seen something specific, but the broad, scanning attention of an animal reading something in the air itself. Mara stood at the door and watched him. She had seen this in animals before. Once, on a boat crossing when she was very young, she had seen the fishing birds stop flying. All of them, all at once, settling onto the water and staying there, not feeding, just sitting, in the absolute stillness of creatures that have decided the sky is no longer safe. Her father had seen her watching them and had said, without alarm but with complete seriousness, "When the birds stop, you sail for shore." She looked at the sky. The horizon to the northwest was the wrong color. Not storm dark. Not yet. Not in any way she could point to and name precisely. But there was a quality to the light in that direction that was different from the light everywhere else. A yellowish tinge at the edge, a slight sickish cast, the kind of color that did not belong to normal cold and normal winter and normal afternoon. She went inside. She put more wood on the fire than she needed for the morning. She filled every container she had with water. She pulled the reserve firewood stack, the stack she had promised herself she would not touch until the deep cold of February, inside the cabin, and stacked it against the western wall. Then she went to find the children. Elsa and Joran had been preparing to walk to the schoolhouse. It was a walk they made 3 days a week, 2 miles across open ground, and they had made it through cold that would have kept most adults indoors. They were practical children, both of them, and they understood that the schoolhouse meant a warm stove, and Wren Calloway and books, and those things were worth the walk. "Not today," Mara said. Elsa looked at the sky. She had her mother's habit of actually using her eyes when she looked at something. "Is something coming?" "I do not know," Mara said. "Possibly. Stay close to the cabin today." Joran was already looking at Birch, who had come back to the cabin entrance and was sitting with his back to the door, facing northwest, unmoving. "He knows," Joran said. "He knows something," Mara said. She spent the morning going from claim to claim. At the Sorensens, Garrett Sorensen listened with the expression of someone trying to be polite about something they find unlikely. His wife stood in the doorway behind him and said nothing, but her eyes moved to the sky as Mara spoke, and they stayed there. At the church, Reverend Moss thanked her for her concern and said only God knows the hour of these things. He said it kindly and completely believed it, and neither kindness nor belief would protect him if Mara was right. At the general store, Harwick received her warning with the mild, considered look of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is extending courtesy by listening at all. "Since when," he said, "does a widow read weather better than a barometer?" She looked at the barometer on the wall behind him, the glass and brass instrument he kept there as a point of pride and reliable measurement. She looked at its face. The needle was not where it should have been for a clear day. It was lower than a clear day warranted. She did not point this out. It would not have helped. "Keep your children home today," she said to the room, to all of them. Then she walked out. The youngest man from the Eastern Claims was outside the store with 2 of his friends, their collars up against the mild, wrong-feeling wind. He said something to the others as she passed, loud enough to carry. Something about the triangle lady and sunshine and fear. She did not look at him. She walked. The sky to the northwest was darker than it had been an hour ago. Elsa and Joran had already gone to the schoolhouse. She found this out when she returned to the claim, and they were not there. She had told them to stay close. She had not told them explicitly not to go to school. And in the precise moral calculus of a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, apparently that distinction mattered. She stood in the doorway and looked at the northwestern sky. What had been a yellow tinge an hour ago was something different now. It had darkened and thickened, the horizon in that direction no longer a line but a mass, not a storm's dark edge, which she would have recognized, but something more total, as if the flat edge of the world itself had lifted from the ground and was moving toward her. The color at its base was deep gray-brown. Above that, churning gray-white. Above that, the ordinary pale sky of a winter afternoon, lit from somewhere behind the mass by a sun that would not be visible for much longer. It was moving, not drifting, moving with the intentional speed of something that had purpose and momentum and was not going to be redirected by anything in its path. 2 miles north, Elsa and Joran were at the schoolhouse. Mara went inside. She put every piece of wood she had on the fire. She wrapped Lena in all the blankets. She looked at the dog. Stay with her. Birch pressed closer to Lena and did not move. Mara put on her coat and her scarf and her heaviest gloves and opened the door. The air that came in was warmer than it should have been. The false warmth of the southern wind that had preceded whatever was coming. The last exhale of a normal day. But beneath the warmth there was a pressure, a density in the atmosphere that she felt in her ears and in the back of her throat. A heaviness that was not cold and was not warmth, but was something the air does when it is in the middle of becoming something else entirely. She looked at the wall to the northwest. It was closer. It was moving faster than she had estimated. She went back inside. She understood, with the cold logic of someone who had spent months learning to calculate what was possible and what was not, that going outside when that wall arrived was not a thing that could be survived. 2 miles across open ground in a whiteout was not a distance. It was a verdict. People had died 10 yards from their own front doors, walking in circles they could not see, until the cold finished what the storm had started. She closed the door. She sat down on the floor beside Lena, and Birch pressed against her side, and she looked at the stove, and she waited. And then she did something she had not done since Eric went under the ice. She prayed, not to anything she could name precisely, not with words she could have written down. She prayed in the direction of the schoolhouse, in the direction of Wren Calloway, who brought flour without being asked, and who would not, Mara believed, had to believe, could not afford not to believe. Let those children close their eyes. Come on, she thought. Come on. The wall arrived. Not gradually. Not the way storms arrive in most memories. With building wind and increasing snow and a gradual deepening of the dark. It arrived the way a door closes. One moment there was the pale light of a winter afternoon coming through the wavy glass of the eastern window. Then the light went yellow. Then brown. Then the sound arrived. Not wind, not the howling she had expected, but something lower and more total, a roar that she felt in her chest before she heard it in her ears, a vibration that came up through the soles of her feet from the frozen ground below. Then everything outside the window ceased to exist. Not darkness. She could see through the glass still. But what she could see was not the prairie, not the cottonwoods, not the outline of the creek. It was a moving gray-white mass, uniform and impenetrable, snow and ice particles driven horizontally at a speed that made them indistinguishable from each other. The world beyond the glass had become a single solid thing, moving, screaming, pressing against every surface it could find. The cabin shuddered, once deeply, like an animal surprised. Then it steadied. Mara pressed her hand against the eastern wall. Cold. The log was cold all the way through, the outside temperature bleeding into the wood, but no draft. The chinking held. She moved to the angled wall closest to the north, pressing her palm flat against each log as she moved toward the vertex. No draft. No draft. A faint whisper near the upper course, where the chinking was thinnest, but nothing that moved the candle flame she held near it. She went to the vertex, the sharp northern point. She put both hands against the converging walls where they met. Outside, on the other side of those logs, the storm was slamming into the pointed edge with everything it had. She could hear it, the difference in pitch at the vertex, a sharp hissing sound where the air split and streamed away down both sides. The pressure was there. The force was there. But it was not concentrated against a flat surface. It was divided, redirected, sent past the cabin in two long streams that carried most of their force with them. The cabin was holding. Lena coughed from the mattress. Birch pressed against the child's side, his weight a warm constant. Mara went to them, felt Lena's forehead. Warm, too warm, the fever that had been building for days. And lifted the child against her chest and rocked her slightly. Not singing, just rocking. The small, reliable motion of a body trying to give another body the information that it was not alone. The storm screamed outside. Inside, the stove burned. The first knock came 2 hours after the storm hit. She heard it because she had been listening for it, not consciously, not with any certainty that it would come, but with the part of herself that was always listening for things that could not be planned for. The knock was not loud. It could not have been loud against the roar of the wind, but it was there, deliberate, repeated, a human sound in the middle of all that inhuman noise. She went to the door. The Sorensen family stood in the remains of their afternoon. The large, good-natured man, his wife, their 2 children, the 4-year-old held against his father's chest with lips that had gone the color of a winter sky. Their faces were encrusted with ice crystals at the hairline, at the eyebrows, at every exposed surface. They had come perhaps 100 yards from their claim, and 100 yards in this had cost them everything they looked like they had left. Our roof came off the north side, the man said. His voice was flat with cold, all inflection frozen out of it. Mara stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." Nothing else. No comment on the name they had given her cabin. No mention of the afternoon she had stood in the store and been laughed at. She moved aside and let them in, and the warmth closed around them, and she went back to the stove to put more wood on. The second knock was Reverend Moss, alone, his coat thick with driven snow, not looking at her face when the door opened. The third was harder. She heard the knock and opened the door, and Harwick was standing in the storm. Not the Harwick of the store, the large and settled man who weighed nails and made pronouncements. something smaller somehow, despite the coat and the hat and the physical size of him. He was looking at the door frame rather than at her, and he had nothing in his hands. No papers, no ledger, nothing transactional. He was just a man standing in a storm that had become larger than any position he had taken. Mara looked at him for a moment. 1 second, no longer than that. Long enough to see what was there and decide what to do with it. She opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "Get warm." He stepped inside. He looked at the interior of the cabin, the triangular space, the low ceiling, the sharp vertex of the north wall, the stove burning in the center. He sat down on the floor without being directed to, in the space that was available, which happened to be near the base of the north wall. He looked at his hands. A fourth knock came from the south, lighter, faster. The knock of someone who has been moving quickly and has arrived with children in tow. Wren Calloway stood in the doorway with 4 of the older school children behind her, their coats white, their faces set with the particular determination of people who have already made a decision and are simply reporting its outcome. She had left before the worst of it hit, she said, and taken the ones who had the farthest to walk home. "We ran," Wren said. That was all the explanation she gave. Mara moved back from the door and let them in. Gruen came last. She had not heard his knock because the storm had reached a pitch that swallowed individual sounds. She simply opened the door on an instinct, the feeling that there was something on the other side that needed to be let in. And he was there, standing at the prow of the cabin in the slight lee created by the pointed vertex, which shed the worst of the wind just enough to make standing possible. He looked at her. She looked at him. No words passed between them. Not yet. She moved back from the door, and he came in, and she closed the door behind him, and the storm screamed on outside. There were 14 people in the cabin. Mara looked at them, at the children arranged near the stove, at the adults sitting against the walls, at Birch pressed against Lena's side, at the fire burning in the iron stove that had crossed 3 days of rail and prairie to get here, and was now doing exactly what it had always been meant to do. She moved to the woodpile and began to add a log. The work of keeping them all alive through the night had begun. 14 people in a space built for 4. The cabin had not been designed with this in mind. Nothing about it, the narrow triangular floor plan, the single stove, the low ceiling that tapered from the wide southern base toward the pointed northern vertex, had been designed with anything in mind except the survival of one woman and her 3 children. The space was 180 square feet at its widest point and diminished steadily as it moved north. Mara managed it. She did not do it with authority. She had no authority, no title, no position in this community that would have given her the right to direct anyone. She did it with knowledge. She knew this space the way she knew her own hands. She knew where the warmth pooled and where the cold crept in. She knew the stove's appetite at different temperatures, how long each type of wood lasted, where the drafts were, and how to reduce them. She knew things about this cabin that no one else in the room could know, because she had built it and lived in it, and fought for it, and stayed in it when every reasonable voice in the valley had told her to leave. That knowledge was a form of authority, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that acts. She placed the children closest to the stove, all of them, not just hers, Leanie on the mattress, the Sorensen child beside her, The two pressed together under the pile of blankets and coats she had stripped from the adults who were in good enough condition to do without. Birch arranged himself along the outer edge of the children's space without being directed, not between them and the stove, which would have blocked the heat, but along the side, a long, warm mass of gray-brown fur that two sets of small hands could reach without moving. The Sorensen man, whose name she now knew was Garrett, had a right hand that had gone wrong in the crossing from his cabin to hers. The fingers stiff and pale, in a way that was not merely cold, but something worse. The early sign of tissue that had been too cold for too long. She made him sit close to the stove and put his hand in a basin of water from the small spring that seeped through the east wall. Not hot, because heat applied too quickly to damaged cold tissue did more harm than the cold itself had done, but warmer than the air, warmer than his hand, warm enough to begin the slow work of return. She had learned this from her father, who had once pulled a fisherman from the water in winter and been told by an old woman in the village what to do and what never to do. Garrett looked at her while she did this. He did not speak. His wife, sitting on his other side with their older child asleep across her lap, watched with the careful attention of someone cataloging information they intend to keep. Reverend Moss sat near the southern wall with the expression of a man in the middle of a private reckoning he was not yet ready to make public. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was a low and somewhat unsteady recitation she recognized as a prayer. No one told him to stop. In the particular circumstances of that night, the words had a different quality than they might have had in the church. Stripped of the performance that enclosed spaces and established ritual, tended to produce and left with something closer to its original purpose. Harwick sat against the north wall, near the vertex. He had not chosen the spot. It was the last space available when he came in. But there was something fitting about it that Mara noticed and did not remark on. He was sitting at the sharp point of the cabin he had called a dead horse's oats, leaning his back against the exact joint she had worried about all autumn, the 60-degree angle that Gruen had predicted would crack in a real blow. The wall behind him was cold, but it was solid. He did not look at her. He looked at his hands, or at the middle distance, or at Lena sleeping on the mattress with the Sorensen child pressed against her. His face held something she had not seen on him before. Not remorse, exactly. Something earlier than remorse. The look of a man who has not yet finished understanding what has happened to him. Gruen sat beside the eastern wall with his back straight and his hands on his knees and looked at the cabin with methodical attention. Not the critical inspection of someone looking for flaws, but the focused examination of someone trying to understand exactly how a thing works. His eyes moved along the wall courses, the notching, the ridge beam, the secondary rafters. He was reading the cabin the way he would read a structure he intended to build, taking note of the decisions. The crack came just after the deepest part of the night, not a log settling, not the ordinary complaint of wood under temperature stress. A specific, brittle sound, like a plate breaking cleanly in two from the upper courses of the vertex joint. Mara was on her feet before the sound had finished. She took the candle from the table and went to the north end of the cabin. Harwick, still awake, shifted to let her pass. She held the flame near the vertex joint, the exact location Gruen had pointed to in November, the exact location she had worried about all autumn, the place where the chinking was thinnest because she had run short of clay and out of time. The candle flame lay flat against the air, horizontal, pulled by moving air from outside. The joint had cracked. When she brought the light closer, she could see the fracture running diagonally across the upper section of the vertex for about 18 inches. The clay split cleanly by the sustained contraction of extreme cold. Through the crack, not wide enough to see daylight through even with a candle, but wide enough to feel. She put her fingers to it and felt the air moving across her skin like water from a cold spring. 14 people in the cabin, the woodpile shrinking, the stove working, and now a crack in the vertex that was going to pull heat out of the space at a rate she could feel, the cold seeping in, not as a flood, but as a steady, patient theft. She needed to seal it. She had no mixed clay. She had used the last of the ready supply weeks ago. She looked at the crack and looked at the cabin and looked at what she had. The blanket was the thickest thing available. The wool blanket that had come in the trunk from the old house, heavy enough that it took both arms to carry, and still held warmth even after months of hard use. She pulled it from the pile and folded it into a tight pad, 4 layers. She pressed it against the crack. The moving air slowed. She needed something to hold it. The crate that served as a table. She dragged it to the north end and stood it on end against the wall, pressing the folded blanket flat against the fracture. She wedged the single pine chair, the one that had traveled in the trunk, against the crate, angling it so that the top rail caught under a protruding log. The assembly pressed together, blanket, crate, chair, wall. A crude construction, nothing an experienced builder would recognize as a repair, but it held. The draft diminished to a thread. The candle flame stood straight. The stove continued to burn. She stood back. Gruen was watching her. He had been watching since the crack sounded. She had been aware of his attention without looking at it directly. The focused observation of a man who builds things, looking at a woman making a repair he would not have expected her to make. In a way, he would not have expected her to make it. He said nothing. She did not look at him. She went back to the stove and put another log on and sat down on the floor. The Sorensen boy had been sitting near the stove without speaking for several hours when Birch appeared beside him. Not dramatically. The dog simply moved from Lena's side. Lena had fallen into a deeper sleep, her breathing steadier now, the fever not gone but not climbing, and came to sit beside the boy. The boy looked at the dog. Birch sat. He did not push himself forward. He simply made himself available, a warm and solid presence in the firelight. His one good ear turned toward the boy, and his damaged ear a shadow on the other side. The boy put his hand out slowly, the cautious movement of a child who has been told to be careful, and touched the dog's side. The cabin was quiet enough in that moment that several people noticed. The conversation that had been going on in low voices near the south wall stopped. Gruen looked up from his examination of the cabin's interior. Even Harwick, who had been maintaining a careful and total stillness since sitting down, shifted his attention toward the 2 small shapes by the stove. The boy's hand moved through the fur. His shoulders dropped, not dramatically, but visibly, the release of a tension he had been carrying since the sound of his family's roof separating from its walls. "Can I keep petting the dog?" he asked. His voice was small and entirely serious. No one answered immediately. Then his mother from across the room said, "Yes, sweetheart, you can." And that was all. The conversation near the south wall resumed, quieter than before. Gruen looked back at the wall. Harwick turned his face toward the vertex joint above him. But something had changed in the room. Some degree of held tension had released. Some collective breath had been let out. The space felt fractionally warmer than it had a moment before, though the stove had not been touched. Near what she estimated was 3 a.m, Wren Calloway came and sat beside her. She sat beside Mara near the stove, close enough to speak quietly without the words carrying to the sleeping figures around them. "The desks are gone," she said. "All of them. I had them broken apart and fed into the stove one at a time. Then the shelving. Then the storage bench. How long did it last?" "Long enough." A pause. "I made the older ones sing. It does not matter what. It matters that it requires effort. You cannot sing and sleep at the same time." She looked at the fire. "I counted them every 20 minutes. All night." Mara looked at this woman who had left flour on her doorstep without knocking, who had brought a letter she could have left at the post, who had come here in the dark with children in tow and found a place along the wall and gotten on with it. "Why did you help me?" Mara asked. "From the beginning, before anyone else would." Wren was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted in the stove, settling. "Because you reminded me," she said, "that being laughed at and being wrong are not the same thing." She did not explain further. Mara understood that the explanation lived somewhere in Wren's own history, in whatever had brought a schoolteacher to the edge of a territory where winters were legendary and the approval of the established order was a thing she had apparently decided to live without. They sat in silence for a while. "Your patch is holding," Wren said, looking at the vertex. "For now. The whole structure is holding." "For now," Mara said again, but she said it differently the second time. Not with doubt, but with the honest acknowledgement of someone who has learned that for now is not a small thing. For now was enough. For now was what you worked toward, 1 hour at a time. And if you managed enough hours of it in a row, eventually you found yourself on the other side of the thing that was trying to stop you. She put another log on the fire. Dawn came as a gradual alteration in the quality of darkness. The light through the wavy eastern window shifted from black to deep blue-gray, then to a pale and watery gray-white. The roar outside began to alter, not softer exactly, but less continuous. There were moments within it now where the pressure eased fractionally and then returned, as if the storm was breathing. Lena moved on the mattress, not the restless, feverish movement of the night hours. Something slower, something that had a different quality. Mara was at her side before the child had fully come awake, her hand on the small forehead before the eyes had opened. Cool, not cold, not the alarming cold of a fever that had broken too fast and swung wrong. Simply cool. Normal. The heat that had been building there for days was simply gone, as if the child's body had resolved its long argument with whatever had been making her ill and had come out the other side in the ordinary early morning of a girl who was 4 years old and had been sick and was no longer. Lena opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the underside of the roof, the ridge beam, the secondary rafters in their fan pattern. She looked at Mara. She looked at Birch, who had moved back to her side sometime in the night and was lying with his chin on the edge of the mattress, watching her with the patient attention of an animal who has been keeping vigil. "Mama," Lena said. Her voice was rough from days of coughing, but it was clear. "I am hungry." Mara looked at her daughter, at the face that had been too hot and too pale for too many days, and was now simply itself. The ordinary face of a small child who had been sick and wanted breakfast. Something happened in Mara's chest. Not a breaking, not the dramatic collapse of held emotion that stories sometimes describe. Something quieter. Something that had been held against a great tension simply released, the way a rope goes slack when the weight it has been bearing is finally set down. She did not cry out. She did not say anything. She put her hand on Lena's cheek and held it there, feeling the ordinary warmth of a healthy child's skin, and breathed. Harwick, in the corner by the vertex, was watching. He was looking at Mara's hand on Lena's face, at the release in Mara's shoulders, at the child's ordinary morning face turning toward the room. His own face held something moving slowly across it, something he was not yet sure what it would be when it arrived. He did not look away. Outside, the storm shifted. The sound of it changed, and this time, what followed the change was not a return to the roar, but a reduction, a lessening, until the sound outside was merely the sound of wind. Hard wind, cold wind, but recognizable wind, the kind that has edges and intervals. The stove was still burning. The woodpile had a few hours left in it. The patch at the vertex was still holding. The cabin had made it through the night. Mara stood up. She went to the stove and put the last substantial log on. She looked at the 14 people in her triangular room, sleeping, waking, holding children, looking at the ceiling, looking at her. And she said, to no one in particular, and to all of them, "It is going to stop soon. When it does, we will see what is left." No one asked her how she knew. They had spent the night in her cabin. They had seen what she knew, and how she had come to know it, and what knowing was worth when the thing that was testing you arrived. The storm eased. The light grew. Outside, slowly, the world began to return. The silence came without warning, not the softening that precedes the end of ordinary storms, the gradual quieting, the wind finding its edges and losing them. This was immediate. One moment the roar was total. The next, it simply was not there. 14 people in a triangular room heard it happen and did not move for several seconds, unsure whether to trust the absence of a sound that had been their entire world. Then Mara stood up and went to the door. She lifted the bar and pushed. The door swung open without resistance. The south-facing entrance, sheltered through the whole storm by the triangular structure behind it, had not drifted over. A light dusting of snow lay on the threshold. She stepped outside. The valley had been remade. Drifts had sculpted the open ground into long, unfamiliar ridges. Fence posts had vanished. The cottonwood trees along the creek stood as white columns, ice-crusted from base to crown. She walked around the cabin to the north end. The vertex was clean. Not dusted. Clean. The sharp point stood in a pocket of bare ground, the logs lightly frosted but clear of accumulation, the snow having divided around the angle exactly as she had designed it to divide. 2 tapered ridges fanned out behind the structure. The drift deposited downwind where it belonged, while the cabin itself sat untouched at the center of its own stillness. She looked east. Niels Dahl's cabin was barely distinguishable from the landscape. The drift against his north wall had reached his roofline, a solid ramp of compacted snow that buried the lower half of his structure entirely. She went back inside. "It is over," she said. "Come and see." She found Elsa and Joran halfway across the open ground, moving south through snow that came to the older children's waists. Wren Calloway led them, a small figure at the front of a ragged line, moving with the purposeful steadiness of someone who had been doing a necessary thing for many hours and intended to keep doing it until it was finished. Elsa had Joran's wrist, not his hand, the grip of someone who had decided that wrists were more reliable than hands. Joran's left boot was soaked through, his gait slightly uneven, but he was walking. "Miss Calloway burned all the desks," Elsa said when they reached each other. Her voice was flat with exhaustion. "Then the shelving, then the bench at the back. She made us sing so we would not fall asleep." Mara pulled both children against her without speaking. The cold of their coats pressed through her own. She held them there in the middle of the open ground, in the silence of the morning after, and breathed. Joran said, muffled against her shoulder, "Is the cabin still there?" "Yes," she said. "Come and see." Halvard Gruen came the following morning, on foot, with his hat in his hands. He walked around the north end of the cabin without speaking. He stood at the vertex for a long time, looking at the clean ground, at the drift pattern, at the absence of accumulation that should have been there. He reached out and touched the logs at the converging joint. He looked east, toward his own roofline, where the drift was still visible from here. Then he came to the door. She opened it before he knocked. He looked at her. He was not a man who decorated his speech. He had told her she would kill her children. He had said it because he believed it, and he had believed it because everything he knew had told him it was true. Everything he knew had been wrong about her. "I was wrong," he said. "Not I am sorry." The specific, unadorned correction of a man setting a record straight, and that was the answer to the question the valley had been carrying since the morning after the storm. The man with his hat in his hands, standing at the door of the cabin he had written off. He had not come to apologize. He had come to learn. He asked to see the vertex joint. She took him inside and showed him the charcoal marking method. Score the angle first. Give yourself a line to follow. Let the blade trace something that already exists rather than inventing the cut mid-swing. She showed him how the ridge beam's weight worked with the geometry, pressing the converging walls together instead of forcing them apart. He tested the joint with his hand. "The weight prevents the splay," he said. "The walls want to push outward," Mara said. "The beam pushes down. They lock each other." He nodded. He walked the full interior slowly, the way a builder walks a space he is learning from. He stopped at the blanket and crate patch at the upper vertex, the repair she had made in the middle of the night, crude and visible and sufficient. "This held," he said. "Through the worst of it. The clay cracked. I did not have anything else." The crack was 18 inches, he said, almost to himself. In a flat north wall, the same crack would have admitted the full wind force. Here the design made the failure small. "Yes," Mara said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to add a prow to my woodshed before next winter. Would you show me the angle?" "Come in the spring," she said, "when the ground thaws. I will show you everything." He collected his hat from the crate. At the threshold, he stopped, turned back once, looked at the vertex. Then he went out and crossed the snow toward his own claim. And halfway across, he stopped and stood still for a long moment, looking back at the pointed cabin against the white sky. Then he kept walking. Niels came that evening. He looked at the cabin's dry floor. His own floor, he told Mara, had been soaked through by morning. The chinking in his north wall had failed in 4 places during the height of the storm. He had gone through his entire wood supply. "My cabin fought the wind," he said. "Yours let it pass." Mara did not say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Harwick came on the 3rd day. He crossed the snow alone, carrying nothing. He stopped a few feet from the door and looked at the cabin, at the pointed north end, the clean ground, the vertex that it held. And then he looked at Mara. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. She unfolded it. The mineral rights claim. The document that had been filed with the county. At the top, in official ink, withdrawn by claimant. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He was not a man who apologized. She had understood this before the storm. He had sat in her cabin through the worst night of the winter, had sat at the vertex, of all places, his back against the joint he had never expected to hold. And he had watched her manage 14 people with the knowledge she had built out of failure and stubbornness and a principle about boat prows that her father had taught her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. He had made his calculation. This was the result. He looked at her once more, not with warmth, but with something real, the look of a man who has revised a prior assessment and is acknowledging the revision without making theater of it. Then he turned and walked away. She watched until he disappeared into the white distance. She stood in the doorway for a while after that, the document in her hand, thinking about Eric, about the 11 days of precedence he had quietly established, about Deacon Aldrich's back room and the leather sleeve and the certified date at the top of the page. He had thought of everything, from under the ice, from the autumn before the ice, from a morning when he had made an appointment with a deacon and said, "Keep this somewhere safe, in case." He had protected her, not by staying, by preparing, in the only way still available to him. She folded the withdrawal and put it in her coat pocket, beside the letter she still carried there. She went inside. Old Caspian Brook was buried 4 days after the storm. He had lived alone 2 miles north, and had been one of the people she had warned that last warm afternoon. He had listened and said, "I have survived worse than this," and closed his door. Mara stood at the edge of the gathered group with Elsa on one side and Joran on the other. She was thinking about the door she had stood at, the mild, wrong-feeling air, the thing she had tried to give him and he had declined. He had not been a bad man. He had been an old man who had survived a great deal and had come to trust his survival as evidence of something permanent. He had been wrong about her and wrong about the storm, and the second wrongness had cost him everything. When the service ended, Reverend Moss came to stand beside her. After a moment, quietly, "He did not have to die. Not accusation. The statement of a man looking directly at a specific truth." "No," Mara said. "He did not." They stood together in the cold field, looking at nothing in particular. Then she walked home. She walked home and did not look back. There was work to be done, as there was always work to be done, and the cabin was still standing, and the children were still alive, and those were facts she chose to carry forward instead of the other ones. That was the part of the story she carried longest. Not the clean vertex, not Gruen's hat in his hands, not the document Harwick had handed her without a word. The part she carried was Caspian Brook's closed door and the mild air of that last ordinary afternoon, and the fact that winning did not mean everyone got to be alive for it. Victory was not the same as wholeness. She had learned that, and she did not try to unlearn it. The years after that winter were not without difficulty. Hard seasons came as they always do. Too little rain, cattle that sickened, prices that did not cover costs. But the claim held, the cabin held, and the knowledge she had built into those cottonwood logs did not stay contained within them. People came to see the cabin that had stood when others had not. She showed them what she had done and why, in the plain language of someone sharing information that might be useful. She drew the floor plan in snow with a stick and explained the angle of the walls and the behavior of wind against a sharp edge versus a flat surface. She explained the charcoal marking method for the vertex notch, the way the ridge beam's weight worked with the converging walls rather than against them, the importance of packing the vertex joint 3 layers deep with moss before the clay went in. When someone called it the Solvang method, she shook her head. "Call it common sense," she said. "My father would say the same." Elsa grew into the practical, far-seeing woman her 9-year-old self had always suggested she would become. She learned to read approaching weather through the behavior of animals and use this knowledge to protect what they had through seasons that cost neighboring operations considerably more. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of using them, of actually looking at what she looked at and following where the looking led. Joran grew into a man who understood that the law was a tool, and tools were only as fair as the people who used them. He made it his work to use it fairly. His first letter home ended the way it always ended. "I use what you taught me. Everything I need is already inside." She read the line and set the letter down and looked at the stove for a long time. Birch died during a mild spell several winters later. He went to sleep beside the stove one evening and did not wake. He had lived long for a dog who had started so thin, and he had spent those years doing what he had always done, positioning himself between the children and whatever direction something unknown might come from, and staying there. Joren came home and placed a small flat stone from the creek bed at the base of the vertex, at the exact point of the prow where the wind divided. He set it down without ceremony and did not explain it. He did not need to. The stone was still there years later, green with moss, settled into its place as if it had always been there and always would be. Many winters after the storm, Mara sat on the southern step in the late afternoon of an early autumn day. The sun was warm on this side. It was always warm on this side, sheltered by the shape of the structure at her back. Elsa's daughter, 8 years old, named after no one in particular, which was its own kind of freedom, sat beside her with her legs dangling off the step. "Did you really build it with just one axe?" the girl asked. "One axe," Mara said. "And everything your great-grandfather taught me." The girl looked at the north end of the cabin. "Why does it come to a point?" Mara stood. She held out her hand. They walked together to the north end, the old woman and the child, moving through long autumn shadows. Mara crouched so her eyes were at the girl's level, both of them looking at the vertex, at the sharp converging angle of the 2 walls, at the small mossy stone at the base of the joint. "Your great-great-grandfather built boats," Mara said. "For the sea. He made them with sharp bows so the water would divide when the boat moved through it." She put her fingers on the joint, on the 60-degree angle she had learned to cut by ruining 3 logs, and then marking the wood with charcoal, and then trying again. He told me that a flat bow fights the water. A sharp bow lets the water fight itself. The girl looked at the point, then up at the sky, at the northwest, at the direction the wind came from in every storm and every season and every winter that had tested the valley since the cabin was built. "So the wind fights itself?" she asked. "Yes," Mara said. "Exactly that." The girl reached out and pressed her small palm flat against the wood, against the exact joint, the place that had cracked in the cold and been held by a folded blanket, and had held and held and held. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Mara looked at her, at the face that carried something from further back than either of them could fully trace. From a boatyard across the water, from a man who had shaped prows and told his daughter that sharpness, done right, was not aggression, but a form of yielding, a way of letting a force spend itself on divided air while you passed through intact. "Yes," Mara said, "I will teach you everything." The sun moved west. The first suggestion of the season's turning came across the valley from the northwest, and it found the vertex of the cabin, and it divided, and it passed. The stone sat at the base of the joint, gray and green and permanent, while the wind went by on either side and carried nothing away. She never used the word aerodynamics. She called it what her father called it, common sense. And if you are facing your own storm right now, remember her. You are stronger than you know. The building had taught her something she had not expected to learn. She had expected it to teach her about wood, how to read grain, how to cut across it, how to match two cut surfaces so they seated flush. She had expected it to teach her about clay and weather and the physics of heat rising from a stove. She had expected difficulty. She had expected failure, and she had expected to recover from failure. What she had not expected was what the building taught her about herself. She was stronger than she had thought, not in the inspirational sense that people meant when they said such things, not the strength of a person who has discovered she is extraordinary. Something more ordinary and more useful than that. She had discovered that she was not as easily broken as she had imagined a woman in her position could be. That she could absorb a morning of failure and begin again in the afternoon. That she could absorb 3 mornings of failure and begin again on the 4th morning with the same intention she had brought to the first. This was not courage in any dramatic sense. It was more like metabolism, the quiet processing of difficulty into something the body could use. She had always been this way, she thought. She simply had not had occasion to notice it before, because before now she had always had Eric. The triangle rose log by log through September and into October, and with it something in Mara that had no precise name rose alongside it. Not confidence exactly, not defiance. Something quieter than either. The knowledge that she was still there, that she was still cutting and notching and rolling logs across 200 yards of prairie grass. That the thing she had said to Joran on the riverbank, "That is our home," was becoming, day by day, true. She did not allow herself to think about what came after the walls. The walls were enough. When the walls were done, the roof would be enough. When the roof was done, the chinking would be enough. She had learned in the months since the train platform to live in the proximate task and not in the total sum of the work remaining. The total sum would have paralyzed her. The proximate task was manageable. Most things that seem impossible are simply a series of manageable tasks seen all at once from too far away. There was a particular quality to the light in those October evenings that she would remember for the rest of her life. The sun dropped early behind the western ridge of the valley, and in the half hour before full dark, the sky turned colors she had no names for. A deep rose along the horizon, shifting up through gradients of amber and copper and the particular blue that comes just at the threshold of darkness. The prairie grass caught that light and held it, turning from silver to gold to rust as the angle changed. The creek caught it too, the surface rippling in the wind so that it flickered between the reflected sky colors and the dark water below. She noticed this because she was almost always outside in that half hour, finishing whatever the day had brought and making ready for the night. She noticed it because beauty, when it arrived in the middle of difficulty, had a particular sharpness to it, as if the contrast between what was hard and what was lovely made the lovely more visible, more distinct, more worth the noticing. Lena would sometimes stand at the edge of the building site in those evenings and simply look at the sky with the open-mouthed absorption of a 4-year-old encountering something her vocabulary has not yet caught up to. She did not say anything. She just looked, and Mara would stop what she was doing and look with her for 30 seconds or a minute, because 30 seconds of shared beauty was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than nothing. These were the moments she did not speak about later, the conversations about the winter, about the storm and the cabin and what had held and what had not, would eventually become something she told and retold, because they had the shape of a story, and stories were what people asked for. But the light in the evenings and Lena standing in it was not the kind of thing that fit inside a story. It was simply what it was. A small good thing in the middle of a hard time, real and unrepeatable, and hers. The days after the storm had a particular quality that the days before it had not. The valley had been, before the storm, a place of quietly competing assessments. The triangle woman and her pie slice. The question of whether she would succeed or fail, survive or leave, prove something or collapse beneath the weight of what she had undertaken. This assessment had organized the social atmosphere of the valley in ways so pervasive they had become invisible. The way the quality of light organizes how a room feels without anyone noticing it is the light doing the work. After the storm, the assessment was done. Not resolved in the simple way of a question answered. Not everyone in the valley had witnessed the same thing. Not everyone had drawn the same conclusions. And not everyone who had changed their position was willing to say so directly. But the organizing question was gone. Whatever Mara was doing on that creekside claim was no longer a subject of speculation about the future. It had become a fact about the past. The cabin had stood. The people inside it had survived. The northern vertex was clean. The practical consequence of this was that help arrived differently. Before the storm, the help that came to the claim arrived sideways, wrapped in excuses, preceded by disclaimers, offered in the form of too much flour accidentally baked, or a horse that needed exercise. This was not dishonesty. It was the social grammar of a community that had not yet decided what Mara's claim meant, and so could not decide what their help of it would mean. After the storm, Garrett Sorensen arrived one morning and spent 4 hours helping her rechink the upper courses of the eastern wall without saying much of anything at all. He had brought his own clay bucket. He had not been asked. He arrived, worked, and left, and the only words exchanged were practical ones about the mixture ratio and the depth of the gaps. His wife came the following week with preserved goods she was frank about, not too much of something she had baked by accident, but a direct transfer of food from one family to another, acknowledged as such, received as such. It was a small shift in social grammar, but it meant something. It meant the conversation about what Mara's presence in the valley signified had reached a different phase. Reverend Moss, who had spent the storm night in the south corner of the cabin with his hat in his hands and his prayers quiet but audible, came to Sunday service the following week and said something from the pulpit that was not quite an acknowledgement of what had happened, and not quite a sermon about humility, and not quite a recognition that the woman who had warned the valley had been right. It was something in the territory between all three. The congregation understood it. They understood it because they had all spent the storm night somewhere, and all of them had thought about the pointed cabin at some point during those hours, and all of them were drawing their own conclusions about what it meant. Life in the valley continued. Winter deepened and then slowly began to ease its grip, the way it always does, not all at once, but in small retreats. A degree warmer here, a day shorter there, until one morning the creek sounded different under the ice, and you understood that something had changed, even if you could not yet say exactly what. The chinking was a kind of thinking. She had not understood this when she started. She had understood it as labor, necessary, time-consuming, physically demanding in the particular way of work that requires both grip strength and precision, the pressing of clay into gaps while keeping her fingers warm enough to feel what she was doing. She had understood it as a problem to be solved, a series of gaps to be sealed, a finite task that would eventually be complete. What she had not understood was that the work itself would teach her things about the cabin that no amount of looking at it from the outside had revealed. The lower courses were solid. The logs there were her largest and best notched, the ones she had cut in the early weeks when she had the most time and the least skill. And somehow this had produced work that was more careful than what came later, when her skill was greater, but her time was short. The lower courses had been given something the upper courses had not: the benefit of her complete attention, undivided by the approaching cold and the shortening days, and the knowledge that she was running out of time. The upper courses were adequate, not good, adequate. She knew the difference now with her fingers, the way an experienced eye knows the difference at a glance. Adequate meant the wind would find the gaps eventually, and finding them would wear at them, and wearing at them would enlarge them, and come January, the result would be work. Come the real cold, the real blow, as Gruen had called it, the result would be more than work. It would be crisis. She packed the upper vertex joints 3 layers deep. Clay, then moss, then clay again, each layer smoothed and pressed before the next was applied. She did this in the mornings when her hands were still fresh, before the day's work had taken the feeling from her fingers. She did it slowly, because slow was what the work required. She did it because the joint at the top of the triangle was the point that mattered most, the place where the 2 walls met, and where, if anything was going to fail, it would fail. Gruen had pointed to it without knowing he was teaching her. She had seen where he looked, and she had known, from that look, exactly what the problem was. She had addressed it as well as she could with what she had. Whether it was well enough, that was a question only a real blow could answer. She pressed the clay in and smoothed it and told herself it was enough. She told herself this not because she believed it entirely, but because the alternative, telling herself it was not enough, served no practical purpose. She had done what she could do. The winter would tell her if it was sufficient. She did not know, until much later, what Joran had made of those months. He told her once, years after the storm, years after he had found his voice, and then his confidence, and then eventually his calling, that what he remembered most was not the cold, or the hunger, or the fear, though all three had been present, and all three had been real. What he remembered most was watching her work. He had watched her from everywhere, from behind the stacked firewood, from the edge of the building site, from the lean-to in the early mornings before she knew he was awake. He had watched her solve the notching problem, though he had not known that was what she was doing. He had seen her sit in the dirt beside 3 ruined logs and look at the sky, and then pick up the charcoal and start again. He had watched her figure out that she could not carry the logs, and so had started rolling them. He had watched her adapt. He did not say any of this at the time. He was 7 years old, and he had not yet found the words for what he was seeing. And by the time he found the words, the moment had passed, and different words were needed for different things. But he had been watching, and what he had learned, without knowing he was learning it, was that the absence of a solution at the beginning of a problem was not the same as the absence of a solution. It was simply the beginning. This was the thing Mara had not known she was teaching him. She had been focused on the wood and the clay and the mathematics of survival, and Joran had been focused on her and what he had extracted from watching her. Quietly, from behind the firewood, in the early light before she knew he was awake, was a model of how to be in the world when the world was not cooperating. She would have been embarrassed to know this. She had not felt, during those months, like someone worth watching. She had felt like someone barely managing, which was what she was. But barely managing, done persistently enough, is its own form of teaching. The lesson is not how to succeed. The lesson is how to return to the work after failing. How to sit in the dirt beside 3 ruined logs, look at the sky, and pick up the charcoal. Joran carried this with him for the rest of his life. He carried it into the cases he took that no one else would take, into the arguments he made that no one else would make, into the long, slow, patient work of changing something that did not want to be changed. He carried it in his handwriting, steady, unhurried, which was, though he did not know it, the same quality his father's handwriting had had, and his grandfather's before that. Everything you need is already inside you. She had said this to him once, in the dark, crouched by a fire lit from flint. She had not known she was giving him something he would carry for the rest of his life. She had been trying to explain a technique for making fire in difficult conditions, but the technique and the principle were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. He understood this, eventually. He thought she probably had too.